The young man who could not tolerate conceit. Rabbi Yosef and Chaim Shimon were very good friends indeed. They admired and loved each other and spent hours together in Torah study. But one thing used to upset the old Rabbi Yosef, and that was when Chaim Shimon would fly at someone who happened to be boasting. Rabbi Yosef disliked boasters as much as Chaim Shimon did, but he felt that Chaim Shimon ought to keep his own feelings in the matter more in check. It was not seemly for such a young man to reprimand older men than himself, even under provocation, he would tell him. For Chaim Shimon, who was generally calm, kindly, and sympathetic by nature, was completely intolerant when it came to meeting anyone conceited or boastful, be he however great in other respects. Rabbi Yosef and he would have heated arguments over this thorny point. Chaim Shimon would quote his old friend Yukutiel, who used to say, "Proud and conceited people are intolerable. Remember King Pharaoh's boastfulness and conceit when he said, 'Who is this God of Israel? I know him not.' That is why God sent the 10 plagues upon him as punishment and destroyed him and his army in the Red Sea. And remember the bad end that Korach came to through his excessive pride." While Chaim Shimon was generally very popular, he certainly did not endear himself to those whom he rebuked so sharply and unceremoniously when he heard them boasting. Whenever Rabbi Yosef tried to convince Chaim Shimon that he ought to refrain from this weakness of his, the latter would always bring quotations from our sages supporting his action. See what we find in the Talmud, Sanhedrin, page 101b. Rabbi Nachman said that the pride which was in Yeravam drove him out of the world. You see that pride is the worst trait in man and leads to all sorts of evil. It desecrates the Torah. So how can one forgive anyone who would do such a terrible thing? The Talmud describes the scholarship of Yeravam in Sanhedrin, page 102a, referring to the verse in 1 Kings 11:29. The prophet Achia Hashileni met him, Yeravam, on the way, and the latter was wearing a new robe. They were both alone in the field. The Talmud then asks what is meant by a new robe, to which Rabbi Nachman replies, "As a new robe is perfect, so perfect was the Torah study of Yeravam." Another tries to interpret it. As this new robe has never previously been seen, so it is with the scholastic achievements that he had made and which had never before been heard of. Then it is further asked, what is meant by the words "they were both alone in the field," to which the answer is given by Rabbi Yehuda, who said, "All other scholars were as the grass of the field in comparison with them." Another interprets it so, as the field was clearly revealed to them, so also was every facet of the Torah. Then Chaim Shimon would conclude his arguments thus: "It can therefore be seen what pride leads to, for all the greatness of his Torah learning did not help Yeravam. He became a sinner and caused others to sin, bringing evil upon himself and upon his fellow Jews." With such convictions firmly implanted within him, it was impossible to get the generally mild Chaim Shimon to restrain himself from coming in contact with anything resembling pride and conceit. Despite this one difference of opinion between Rabbi Yosef and Chaim Shimon, they continued to be the best of friends, greatly attached to each other. The latter was also a great favorite with the vast majority of people in Dober Mizzle, and this continued until something happened one day, the scene being the baths in Dober Mizzle. The Merchatz in Dober Mizzle, like that of any other town or townlet, was an important institution. Twice weekly, on Wednesdays for women and Fridays for men, the place hummed busily like a marketplace. On other days of the week, the bath would only be very slightly heated, just enough to warm the water for those who wished to use the mikveh. Rabbi Yosef in his youth had installed one of his famous ovens at the baths, which, after having but a few bucketfuls of water poured onto it, gave out such terrific steam that whoever might be steaming himself on the top step in the steam room very hurriedly had to descend to a more bearable position. In view of the fact that the cistern there was not very large, there could only be a limited supply of hot water at one time. Furthermore, it was a recognized practice that each bather was entitled to at least 5 bucketfuls each. It was obviously out of the question to allow unrestricted attendance at the baths. It was therefore so arranged that people came according to fixed times in rotation, so that everyone had a turn. Thus it came about that the same group of people always met whenever they attended the baths. At that time, Debre Mizl was honored by the presence of the old and famous scholar Rabbi Betzalel, who had come from Rososno to visit his son's son-in-law, Rabbi Yeshua Feitel the scribe. Rabbi Betzalel had isolated himself for over 40 years in order to devote himself completely and undisturbed to the study of the Torah. He had earned a name for himself as a brilliant scholar and a God-fearing Jew. He was renowned too for his purity of character, for the fact that he never uttered an unnecessary word, and in general, for his careful observance of all the mitzvahs. He always examined the parshias of his tefillin and the letters in his mezuzahs with a magnifying glass to make sure that the letters had no white specks, but were completely filled in with ink. He would also measure his tefillin daily to make sure that the shoresh and shoyad had not become out of shape, but had kept their squareness intact. He also took the unusual precaution of appointing someone to stand and watch him all the time he was davening to make sure that his shoresh and shoyad did not get out of place. Rabbi Betzalel showed the greatest respect to scholars recognized for their learning, and saw to it that others should carry out this mitzvah too, for he regarded it highly. On this basis, therefore, he felt that he ought to attract attention to his own great scholarship, so that people would have the opportunity of paying respect to his Torah knowledge and thus earn a mitzvah. So Rabbi Betzalel, who was now over 80 years old, commanded a great deal of respect in Debre Mizl. Rabbi Betzalel went to the Merchatz on Friday, and here too, everyone paid him exceptional respect. A special place was allotted to him, and everyone stood up at his entrance. Chaim Shimon also happened to be there on this occasion, and while he knew that it is not necessary to stand up as a sign of respect to anyone when one is at the baths, he stood up together with the others, who were all ordinary men, unacquainted with the Talmudic ruling laid down in Kedushin, page 33. There the distinction is made that in the rooms where people are clothed, they may discuss Torah and must show respect to Torah scholars. But in those rooms of the baths where people are naked, engaged in bathing themselves, it is forbidden to discuss Torah and unnecessary to show respect to scholars by standing up at their approach or in their presence. Chaim Shimon saw no harm in doing as the others did by standing up when Rabbi Betzalel entered, for he did not wish to enter into a discussion with the people present, as that would have entailed Torah talk, which was forbidden. It so happened that there was a shortage of hot water, and a man started to shout to the attendant, "Hey there, bring some hot water and hurry, it's for our distinguished Rabbi Betzalel." Two Jews were standing in the corner washing themselves, looked toward Rabbi Betzalel, who did not seem within hearing range, and one said to the other, "You know, this Rabbi Betzalel has lived in isolation for 40 years studying." Evidently, Rabbi Betzalel's hearing was better than they thought, for he called out to them, "Actually, it was not 40 years, but 47 years that I studied in isolation, and what is more, I never took a step outside of it from the day I began this particular way of life." Chaim Shimon heard this, and his blood boiled to hear such self-praise from one whom he felt should know better, but he kept tight hold on himself. He did not want to say anything to the old Rav in the presence of the others. However, he approached Rabbi Betzalel immediately after he had dressed himself in his corner of the dressing room, and Chaim Shimon had also dressed himself. "Rabbi," he asked, "I should like to ask you something, if I may." "What is it you want to know?" Rabbi Betzalel asked. "It seems to me," went on Chaim Shimon, "that you do not interest yourself in the injunction of our Tanaim, Amoraim, and Gaonim that we should not at any time display any sign of conceit. When you heard those two Jews in the bath say that you had spent 40 years in isolated study, you were not satisfied with their praise, but took the opportunity of pointing out that you merited still greater praise, as you had actually studied in isolation for 47 years, and furthermore that you had never turned aside from your way of life since the day you began. Is this self-praise justifiable, and is it not a sign of boastfulness and conceit? Surely you must know that the Gaon Rabbi Aryeh Leib, the head of the Mesivta in Minsk, used to explain and elaborate upon the saying of Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Rav, above Basra, page 98, that anyone who pretends to be a greater scholar than he is not entitled to enter God's Mechitza." While Chaim Shimon was talking rather heartedly to Rabbi Betzalel, for Chaim Shimon was genuinely upset and even angry at the display of boastfulness on the part of the old scholar. People had come in and listened to Chaim Shimon's outburst in some astonishment. They did not understand all he was saying, but they felt that it was something of an impertinence for such a young man so to address an old and respected scholar. Others who had grasped that Chaim Shimon was rebuking Rabbi Tzala for having spoken up in his own praise felt that the former had probably gone beyond his rights, but secretly they thought he was not entirely wrong in his condemnation.